I watched through my kitchen window as Karen loaded the last piece of my firewood into her pristine white SUV. 6 months of backbreaking work. 6 months of splitting, stacking, and preparing for the brutal winter ahead. Gone in 30 minutes while I was at the grocery store. She did not ask permission. She did not leave a note. She just took what she wanted because she could. Because she was the HOA president and I was just another homeowner she could push around. But as I stood there watching her drive away with my winter fuel supply, something inside me snapped. The same woman who had terrorized our neighborhood for 3 years with her petty rules and power trips had finally crossed a line she could not uncross. That night I made a decision that would change everything. Karen wanted my firewood so badly. Fine. I would give her exactly what she deserved. My name is David, and for 2 years I lived what I thought was the perfect suburban dream. My house sat on a beautiful half-acre lot in Pinewood Estates, a quiet community where kids rode bikes on tree-lined streets and neighbors waved to each other every morning. I had spent countless weekends that summer and fall preparing for winter. Every Saturday, I drove my pickup truck to the local Forest Service area where they sold permits for dead timber removal. I would spend hours selecting the best pieces of oak and maple, loading them carefully into my truck bed. The work was hard but satisfying. Back home, I would spend Sunday afternoons splitting logs with my grandfather's old splitting maul. The rhythmic swing of the heavy tool, the satisfying crack as wood split cleanly down the grain, the growing pile of perfectly cut firewood. It connected me to something primal and honest about providing for myself. My firewood stack grew throughout the autumn months. Neat rows of split oak and maple, stacked precisely to allow air circulation for proper drying. By November, I had nearly 3 full cords arranged along the side of my garage. Enough fuel to keep my fireplace burning through the coldest winter nights. The weather forecasters predicted a brutal winter ahead. Record low temperatures, heavy snowfall, and extended cold snaps that could strain the electrical grid. My firewood represented security and independence. While my neighbors relied entirely on expensive heating bills, I had prepared for whatever winter could throw at us. I followed every HOA rule to the letter. The firewood was stacked neatly on my own property, away from property lines, and covered with a brown tarp that met community aesthetic guidelines. I had even submitted the required notification form about storing combustible materials, though it seemed ridiculous to need permission to heat my own home. The first signs of trouble came through official-looking letters in my mailbox, violation notices for trivial infractions. My garbage can was 18 inches too far from the curb on pickup day. My mailbox post needed repainting because a small scratch was visible from the street. My lawn had 2 dandelions that violated the weed-free landscape requirements. Each letter carried the signature of Karen Mitchell, HOA president, written in sharp, aggressive handwriting that somehow looked angry even on paper. Each violation came with a $25 fine and a threat of escalating penalties for repeat offenses. I paid the fines and fixed the problems. I wanted to be a good neighbor, even if the rules seemed excessive. The community was beautiful, property values were strong, and most of my neighbors were genuinely nice people trying to live peaceful lives. But that Thursday evening in late November, everything changed. I returned from a quick grocery run to find my firewood stack completely gone. 3 cords of perfectly seasoned hardwood that represented months of work and hundreds of dollars in permits and gas money. Vanished. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I walked around my garage 3 times, checking every angle, wondering if I had somehow forgotten where I stacked my winter fuel supply. but the empty space where my firewood had been was undeniable. Even the brown tarp lay folded neatly on the ground, as if whoever took my wood wanted to return my covering out of politeness. My heart pounded as the reality sank in. Someone had stolen my entire winter preparation while I was gone for 45 minutes buying groceries. In broad daylight, in a supposedly safe neighborhood, someone had backed up a truck and methodically loaded every piece of my firewood. I spent that entire evening walking through my neighborhood, looking for any sign of my missing firewood. I checked every yard, every driveway, every visible storage area within 6 blocks of my house. Nothing. 3 cords of split hardwood do not just disappear without leaving some trace behind. The next morning, I called the police to report the theft. Officer Martinez arrived within an hour, a professional woman in her 30s who took detailed notes and photos of the empty space where my firewood had been stacked. "Any idea who might have taken it?" she asked, clicking her pen as she finished writing her report. "I honestly have no clue," I replied. "I mean, who steals firewood? It is not exactly something you can sell easily." Officer Martinez nodded sympathetically. "You would be surprised. Firewood theft is more common than people think, especially before cold snaps. Without witnesses or security footage, though, these cases are tough to solve." She handed me a case number and promised to patrol the area more frequently, but I could tell from her tone that my firewood was gone forever. The police had bigger problems than missing logs. That afternoon, as I stood in my empty driveway wondering how I would heat my home through the winter, Karen Mitchell appeared at my front door. She wore her usual outfit of crisp khaki pants and a navy blazer that made her look like she was running for political office rather than managing a homeowners association. "David, I need to speak with you about your firewood situation," she said without any greeting or pleasantries. "What firewood situation?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Someone stole my entire supply yesterday." Karen smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. It was the tight, controlled smile of someone who enjoyed having power over others. "Actually, I removed your firewood because it was in violation of community standards," she said, consulting a thick folder of paper she carried like armor. Section 12.4 of the HOA Covenants clearly states that combustible materials cannot be stored in quantities exceeding 1/2 cord without written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I stared at her in disbelief. "You took my firewood, you stole my property." "I did not steal anything," Karen replied with practiced bureaucratic coldness. "I confiscated materials that were stored in violation of community regulations. The firewood has been redistributed to community members who are in compliance with storage requirements." "Redistributed?" My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "You gave away my firewood to other people." Karen's smile widened slightly. "The community operates as a collective, David. Individual property rights are secondary to the greater good of maintaining our standards and property values." I felt my face burning with anger and disbelief. "I spent 6 months cutting and stacking that wood. I have receipts for the permits. That was hundreds of dollars worth of fuel for my fireplace." "Should have read the covenants more carefully," Karen said, flipping through her papers. "I also noticed your mailbox needs attention again. The scratch repair you did last month is already showing wear. That is another violation." She handed me a fresh citation form with my name already filled in at the top. $25 fine for mailbox maintenance failure. Due in 10 days or the penalty would double. "You cannot just take people's property because of technicalities in an HOA agreement," I said. my hands shaking as I held the violation notice. Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. I can do whatever is necessary to maintain community standards, David. The board has given me full authority to enforce compliance. If you do not like the rules, you are free to move somewhere else. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking aggressively on my concrete walkway. I watched her climb into her white SUV and drive away, leaving me standing in my doorway holding a violation notice for a scratched mailbox, while my entire winter fuel supply had been redistributed to her chosen neighbors. That night I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's smug smile and heard her casual admission that she had taken my property. Not stolen, she claimed. Confiscated, redistributed, as if using bureaucratic language made theft legal. I realized this was not about Firewood or HOA rules. This was about power and control. Karen had found a system that allowed her to bully and intimidate people with impunity, hiding behind official-sounding policies while exercising petty tyranny over anyone who caught her attention. The next morning, I began what I thought would be a simple process of getting my firewood back through official channels. I started by calling the HOA management company listed on my monthly dues statements. Pinewood Estates Management, this is Jessica, came the cheerful voice on the phone. Hi Jessica, I need to file a complaint about the HOA president confiscating my property, I explained. She took 3 cords of firewood from my yard without notice and gave it away to other residents. There was a long pause. I will need to transfer you to our legal compliance department. Please hold. 20 minutes of hold music later, I reached Marcus in legal compliance. He listened to my story with professional detachment, asking me to repeat details and spell names multiple times. Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration, Marcus finally said. However, Mrs. Mitchell has broad enforcement authority under the community covenants. If she determined your firewood storage violated regulations, she was within her rights to remediate the situation. Remediate? I could not believe the corporate doublespeak. She stole my property and gave it away. How is that remediation? The materials were redistributed to community members in compliance with storage requirements, Marcus replied, clearly reading from a script. This ensures uniform enforcement of community standards. I spent 2 hours on that phone call, escalating through 3 different supervisors, only to be told repeatedly that Karen had acted within her authority. The management company would review my complaint, but the process could take 60 to 90 days, and there was no guarantee of any remedy. My next step was requesting a hearing before the HOA Board of Directors. I submitted the required written request, paid the $50 hearing fee, and waited 3 weeks for my scheduled appearance. The hearing took place in the community center on a Tuesday evening. 5 board members sat at a folding table facing a single chair where I was instructed to sit. Karen presided over the meeting from the center position, flanked by 4 neighbors I recognized, but had never really met. Mr. Thompson, you have requested this hearing to dispute an enforcement action taken by the board, Karen began, reading from prepared notes. Please state your case. I explained the situation clearly and calmly. I presented my firewood permit receipts, photos of my neat storage arrangement, and documentation that I had submitted all required notifications. I pointed out that Karen had admitted to taking my property and giving it away without due process. The board members listened politely, asking no questions and taking no notes. When I finished, Karen responded immediately. The enforcement action was necessary and appropriate, she said. Mr. Thompson's firewood storage exceeded permitted quantities and posed a fire hazard to the community. The materials were redistributed to ensure compliance and community safety. What fire hazard? I asked. The firewood was stacked properly, covered, and stored on my own property away from structures. Karen consulted her papers. Section 12.4 clearly limits combustible material storage to 1/2 cord without architectural review committee approval. Mr. Thompson never submitted a request for additional storage capacity. Because I did not know such a request was required, I replied. The storage limit is not mentioned in any of the main HOA documents I received when I bought my house. Ignorance of community covenants is not an excuse for noncompliance, Karen said with finality. The board voted unanimously to uphold Karen's enforcement action. 4 neighbors who probably knew nothing about firewood storage or HOA law rubber-stamped her decision without discussion or deliberation. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. I consulted with a real estate attorney the following week. Janet Rodriguez had 20 years of experience with HOA disputes and property law. She reviewed my case file with professional skepticism. Technically, they might be within their rights, she admitted after an hour of document review. HOA covenants can be incredibly broad, and enforcement discretion usually lies with the board. The language about combustible materials is vague enough that they could interpret it several ways. So they can just steal my property and there is no recourse, I asked. It is not legally theft if they were acting under covenant authority, Janet explained. To challenge this, we would need to prove the enforcement was arbitrary, discriminatory, or outside their granted powers. That requires extensive discovery, depositions, and potentially years of litigation. She quoted me a retainer fee of $5,000 just to begin the process, with no guarantee of success or recovery of my firewood. The legal costs would far exceed the value of what I had lost. I left her office understanding a harsh reality. Karen had created a system where she could take whatever she wanted from community members while hiding behind legal technicalities and bureaucratic procedures. She had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, and there was no official recourse for her subjects. That night, I realized that sometimes justice has to be personally delivered when the system refuses to function. Over the next 2 weeks, I began paying closer attention to Karen's patterns and behavior around the neighborhood. I started taking evening walks, observing her routines and noting her habits with the methodical approach of someone gathering intelligence. Karen drove the same route through the community every morning at 7:30, checking for violations with the dedication of a patrol officer. She carried a digital camera and a clipboard, photographing anything that caught her attention. Garbage cans placed too early, lawn sprinkler overspray on sidewalks, holiday decorations left up past approved dates. More importantly, I discovered that my firewood was not the first property Karen had redistributed for community compliance. Mrs. Chen from Maple Street mentioned that Karen had removed her decorative garden gnomes for being inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. The Johnsons lost their children's swing set because it was 6 inches inside the front yard setback requirement. But the most interesting pattern I observed was Karen's habit of driving through the neighborhood on Saturday afternoons, looking for items she could claim for herself under the guise of HOA enforcement. A nice patio umbrella that was improperly stored, a set of outdoor furniture that violated color guidelines, a decorative fountain that exceeded noise ordinances. I watched her load these confiscated items into her SUV, ostensibly to redistribute them to compliant community members. But I never saw her actually giving anything away. I began to suspect that Karen's enforcement actions were less about community standards and more about acquiring things she wanted for free. The idea for perfect revenge came to me during one of these observation walks. I was examining a fallen oak tree in the community's common area, noting how insects had already begun boring into the dead wood, when inspiration struck like lightning. Karen wanted firewood so badly that she would steal it from her neighbors. Fine. I would give her exactly what she deserved. I began researching hollow logs and insect infestations with the thoroughness of a graduate student. I learned that certain beetles and ants naturally colonize dead wood, creating extensive tunnel systems that leave logs looking solid from the outside, while being completely hollowed from within. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. I would prepare hollow logs filled with aggressive ant colonies, stack them visibly on my property, and wait for Karen to steal them again. When she brought her stolen firewood home and tried to burn it, she would get a very unpleasant surprise. Finding suitable logs took 3 weekends of searching. I drove to different forest areas, looking for oak and maple pieces that had been dead long enough for insects to hollow them out, but not so decayed that they would crumble when moved. I needed logs that looked like premium firewood from the outside, but were actually insect apartment buildings on the inside. I found perfect specimens in a clearing about 30 miles from town. Fallen trees that had been dead for at least 2 years, with bark still intact but wood thoroughly excavated by boring beetles. I loaded 12 of the best pieces into my truck, carefully to avoid disturbing whatever creatures might already be living inside. Back home, I prepared each log with scientific precision. Using a small drill, I created additional entry points and carefully introduced red harvester ants from colonies I found in my backyard. These ants were aggressive defenders of their territory and would not appreciate being disturbed or burned. I sealed the entry holes with tree sap and bark fragments, making the modifications invisible to casual inspection. From the outside, my hollow logs looked like premium seasoned hardwood. Inside, they teemed with hundreds of very unhappy insects. The final step was creating the perfect presentation. I stacked my ant-filled logs in the exact same location where my original firewood had been stored. I covered them with the same brown tarp Karen had so politely folded and left behind. Everything looked identical to my previous setup, down to the precise arrangement and spacing. I even planted evidence to make the trap irresistible. I left a receipt from the Forest Service visible under one corner of the tarp, showing a recent purchase of premium hardwood cutting permits. I wanted Karen to think she was stealing freshly cut, expensive firewood. The psychological aspect was important too. I made sure to be visible working around my property, giving Karen opportunities to observe my new firewood supply. I wanted her to know exactly what I had and where I kept it. The better informed she was, the more likely she would take the bait. On the Friday evening when everything was perfectly prepared, I positioned myself in my kitchen with a clear view of the firewood stack. I had my camera ready and my phone charged. When Karen made her move, I would document everything for my own satisfaction and protection. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for Karen's predictable greed to spring it. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, perfect weather for someone to think about needing firewood for cozy winter fires. I positioned myself at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a clear view of my carefully prepared ant-filled logs. At exactly 10:15, Karen's white SUV appeared at the end of my street. She drove slowly, scanning each property with her usual predatory attention to detail. I watched her pause in front of the Henderson house, photographing what appeared to be Christmas lights that were probably installed 2 days early according to her ridiculous seasonal decoration schedule. She continued her patrol route, but I noticed her slowing down as she passed my driveway. Her head turned toward my firewood stack, and I could see her calculating expression even from 50 yards away. She had spotted her next target. Karen completed her neighborhood circuit and disappeared around the corner. I knew she would be back. Her pattern was always the same. First the surveillance pass, then the return trip for closer inspection, followed by the actual confiscation once she convinced herself that she had proper justification. 20 minutes later, she was back. This time she parked directly across the street from my house and sat in her SUV for several minutes, staring at my firewood stack. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she prepared her rationalization for taking my property again. She climbed out of her vehicle and walked directly to my front door. I let her ring the doorbell twice before answering, wanting to appear naturally surprised by her visit rather than like someone who had been watching her every move. "Good morning, David," she said with her trademark fake smile. "I could not help but notice you have been storing combustible materials again." "Yes, I bought new firewood," I replied, keeping my voice neutral and cooperative. "I made sure to stay within the half-cord limit you mentioned last time." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. She had not expected me to acknowledge storage limits or appear compliant with her arbitrary rules. "I will need to inspect the storage arrangement to ensure proper compliance," she said, already walking toward my garage without waiting for permission. I followed her outside, playing the role of a concerned homeowner eager to avoid further violations. Karen examined my log stack with the attention of a quality control inspector, lifting the tarp and counting pieces with bureaucratic thoroughness. "This appears to exceed the permitted quantity," she announced after her inspection. "I count 16 pieces of firewood, which clearly surpasses the half-cord limitation." "I counted 12 pieces when I stacked them," I said, knowing she was inflating the numbers to justify her theft. "But if you think it is too much, I can certainly move some pieces to comply with the rules." "That will not be necessary," Karen replied quickly. "For efficiency and community safety, I will redistribute the excess materials to residents who are in proper compliance." There it was, the same euphemistic language she used to justify stealing from her neighbors: redistribution for community safety, confiscation to ensure compliance. She had perfected the art of bureaucratic theft. "When would you like me to move the excess pieces?" I asked, maintaining my cooperative facade. "I will handle the redistribution today to ensure immediate compliance," Karen said, already pulling out her phone to make arrangements. "Please have the materials ready for removal within the next 2 hours." She walked back to her SUV with the satisfied stride of someone who had just successfully bullied another neighbor into submission. I watched her drive away, knowing she would return with help to load my hollow ant colonies into her vehicle. Back inside my house, I positioned myself for the perfect viewing angle. I had my camera ready and a clear line of sight to watch Karen spring the trap she had set for herself through her own greed and sense of entitlement. At 12:30, Karen returned with her usual accomplices for these redistribution operations: her husband Gary and their teenage son Brandon. Gary drove their pickup truck while Karen supervised from her SUV, directing the loading operation like a general commanding troops. I watched through my window as they approached my carefully prepared firewood stack. Gary and Brandon began loading the hollow logs into the truck bed, while Karen checked items off her clipboard, treating stolen property like a legitimate inventory transfer. The irony was perfect. Karen's own family was helping her steal firewood that would soon fill her house with very unhappy insects. Her son Brandon handled each log carefully, completely unaware that he was loading biological warfare disguised as heating fuel. The entire theft took less than 15 minutes. Gary and Brandon worked efficiently, loading all 12 ant-filled logs while Karen maintained her supervisory role. She even folded my tarp again, leaving it neatly on the ground as if her politeness somehow legitimized the theft. I photographed the entire operation from my kitchen window, documenting Karen's systematic theft of my property. But more importantly, I watched with deep satisfaction as she transported her own doom directly to her front door. The trap was sprung. Now all I had to do was wait for the fireworks to begin. Sunday evening brought the first cold snap of the season. Temperatures dropped into the 20s, and I could see chimney smoke rising from houses throughout the neighborhood as families lit their first fires of winter. Perfect weather for someone to want to test their newly acquired firewood. I had barely finished dinner when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown local number, but I answered anyway. "Is this David Thompson?" came a panicked female voice I immediately recognized as Karen's, though she sounded nothing like her usual controlled, authoritative self. "Yes, this is David," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Did you do something to that firewood?" Karen's voice was shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. "What firewood?" I asked innocently. "You redistributed my firewood yesterday, remember, for community compliance." There was a long pause filled with what sounded like chaos in the background. I could hear her husband Gary shouting something about calling an exterminator, and what might have been vacuum cleaner running at full power. "My house is full of ants," Karen screamed into the phone. "Thousands of them. They came out of the logs when we put them in the fireplace." I paused for exactly the right amount of time to convey confusion rather than satisfaction. "That sounds terrible, Karen. Are you sure the ants came from firewood? Maybe you have an infestation problem." "Do not play dumb with me," she shrieked. "You did something to those logs. This is sabotage." "I am not sure what you are talking about," I replied calmly. "You confiscated firewood from my property because it violated HOA regulations. I assumed you redistributed it to compliant community members, just like you said you would." The background noise intensified. I could hear Brandon yelling something about ants in his bedroom, and Gary cursing as he apparently tried to contain the invasion. "You set me up," Karen accused, her voice cracking with the strain of dealing with an ant apocalypse while trying to maintain her usual intimidating phone presence. "Karen, I think you are upset and maybe not thinking clearly," I said with mock concern. "If you are having pest control issues, you should probably call a professional exterminator instead of calling your neighbors." "I know this was you," she insisted, but I could hear her confidence wavering. She had no proof, no evidence, no way to demonstrate that I had done anything other than stack firewood on my own property. "I hope you get your ant problem resolved," I said sympathetically. "That sounds really unpleasant. Maybe next time you should inspect firewood more carefully before bringing it into your house." I hung up before she could respond, then immediately called my neighbor Tom, who lived 2 houses down from Karen. Tom was a retired firefighter who had been one of Karen's victims earlier in the year, when she forced him to remove a memorial flag display for his deceased military father. "Tom, this is David Thompson," I said when he answered. Are you seeing what is happening at Karen's house? Oh man, it is incredible, Tom replied, barely containing his laughter. There are exterminators, pest control trucks, and some kind of industrial cleaning service. Gary is out front with the garden hose spraying down furniture they are hauling out of the house. I walked to my front window and could see the chaos even from 4 houses away. Karen's pristine white SUV sat in her driveway surrounded by service vehicles. Her perfectly manicured lawn was covered with furniture, rugs, and household items that had apparently been evacuated from the ant invasion. What do you think happened? I asked Tom, enjoying the theater of concerned neighbor curiosity. Word is they tried to burn some firewood and unleashed hell, Tom said. Karen is running around screaming at everyone. Gary looks like he wants to disappear, and their kid is staying at his grandmother's house until they get it sorted out. Over the next 3 days, the drama at Karen's house continued to unfold like the world's most satisfying reality television show. Professional pest control teams came and went. A restoration company arrived to assess damage from the attempted fumigation. Karen herself was conspicuously absent, apparently staying elsewhere while her home was professionally de-antied. The neighborhood gossip network, normally focused on trivial complaints about parking and lawn maintenance, suddenly had real entertainment. Everyone wanted to know how Karen's house had become ground zero for an ant invasion. Theories ranged from structural problems to karma, finally catching up with the community's least popular resident. Mrs. Patterson from across the street stopped by my house Wednesday evening with a casserole and undisguised curiosity. Did you hear about Karen's pest problem? She asked with the barely contained excitement of someone sharing delicious gossip. I heard there was some kind of ant situation, I replied with appropriate neighbor concern. That sounds awful. Apparently they brought in contaminated firewood, Mrs. Patterson continued. The exterminator said he had never seen anything like it. Thousands of ants just exploded out of logs they put in their fireplace. That is terrible luck, I said, shaking my head sympathetically. You really have to be careful about where you get firewood. Insects can hollow out logs and you would never know until it is too late. The funny thing is, nobody knows where they got the wood, Mrs. Patterson added. Karen claims someone set her up, but Gary told the pest control guy they just picked up some logs that were available for redistribution. I nodded thoughtfully. Well, I hope they get it resolved soon. Nobody deserves an ant invasion, even if they might have been careless about checking their firewood source. By Thursday, Karen's house was habitable again, but her reputation as the neighborhood's untouchable authority figure was permanently damaged. The woman who had terrorized residents with petty enforcement actions had been brought low by her own greed and some very determined insects. The best part was that she could never prove anything. She had stolen firewood from my property and taken it home without inspection. Any contamination was her own responsibility, the natural consequence of taking things that did not belong to her. Justice had finally been served, one ant at a time. Karen's behavior toward me changed dramatically after the ant incident. The aggressive enforcement action stopped. The trivial violation notices disappeared from my mailbox. When we encountered each other during neighborhood walks, she would nod politely and hurry past without making eye contact. More importantly, other residents began to notice Karen's reduced intimidation tactics. Without her constant harassment, people started relaxing and enjoying their homes again. The Henderson family put up their Christmas lights 2 days early without receiving violation notices. Mrs. Chen replaced her garden gnomes with even more decorative versions. The Johnson children got a new swing set that was exactly where the old one had been. Tom stopped by my house the following Saturday with a six-pack of beer and a huge grin. "I do not know how you did it," he said, settling into one of my patio chairs, "but Karen has been completely different since her pest control adventure. She has not bothered anyone in 2 weeks. Maybe she learned that taking things that do not belong to you can have unexpected consequences," I replied, accepting a beer and enjoying the satisfaction of a job well done. "The whole neighborhood is talking about it," Tom continued. "People are calling it the Great Ant Liberation. Karen went from HOA dictator to laughingstock in one evening." The long-term effects were even more satisfying than the immediate justice. At the next HOA board meeting, Karen announced she would not be seeking re-election as president. She cited personal commitments and a desire to focus on her family, but everyone knew the real reason. Her authority had been shattered along with her confidence. The board elected Tom as the new president in a unanimous vote. His first official action was reviewing all enforcement policies and rescinding dozens of petty regulations that served no legitimate community purpose. The half-cord firewood limitation disappeared along with restrictions on garden gnomes, swing set placement, and early holiday decorations. I restocked my firewood supply that December, purchasing premium oak and maple from a local supplier who guaranteed pest-free, kiln-dried logs. I stacked them in exactly the same location where my ant colonies had waited for Karen's greed. This time, nobody bothered me about quantities or compliance issues. Winter passed peacefully in Pinewood Estates. My fireplace provided comfortable warmth through the coldest nights, fueled by honestly purchased wood that had never been anyone else's property. Karen's house showed no signs of pest problems, suggesting that professional exterminators had successfully resolved her ant situation. The most satisfying outcome was the transformation of our community culture. Without Karen's reign of petty tyranny, neighbors began talking to each other again. Children played freely in yards without fear of violation notices. Families decorated their homes according to personal taste rather than HOA dictates. Sometimes justice requires patience, planning, and the willingness to let natural consequences teach important lessons. Karen had built her power on the assumption that she could take whatever she wanted without facing meaningful resistance. She discovered that assumption was wrong in the most memorable way possible. My grandfather always told me that honest work and fair dealing would eventually triumph over bullying and theft. He was right, though he probably never imagined that triumph would involve quite so many ants. These days, when I split firewood in my backyard, I often think about the importance of preparation and the satisfaction that comes from providing for yourself through honest effort. And sometimes, when I stack my logs in neat, precise rows, I smile remembering the day Karen learned that stolen firewood burns very differently than expected.